I'll add a suggestion of that blue sky here that is reflecting its color into the shadow side right there of this polyhedron. Now let's say I had a red surface here that was reflecting its color as well into the shadow side. So that color would be reflected right there. And when you mix red and green, they neutralize each other. So a grayed red would result. And you can see a little bit of that red right there being reflected into the shadow and being grayed by that green within the shadow. But it's still bright enough so that you can see that there's a red being reflected into the shadow, like this. So you see all of these different colors occurring within the shadow. Reds and blues and oranges, and then of course the green of the shadow. And it makes for color variety that is found within a shadow. Makes that shadow color much more interesting than if you just added one flat green color. And within the cast shadow here, some of this blue of the sky is also reflected into the cast shadow. So I'm adding some of that, like this. What I did to the polyhedron form, I'm now going to do to the spacecraft. So I'm going to start off by adding, I think, a blue background, because I want that blue to be reflected into the shadow color. Going to keep the blue somewhat saturated, not too muted. Brighter colors reflect their colors into the shadow. If the color is too desaturated, then you're not going to get any reflections. The color has to be intense enough or saturated enough so that its color can then be reflected into the shadow side of a form. And I think I'll add an orange color to complement to the blue, to the ground, since that's what I used for the ground plane with the polyhedron form. And that ground color will be reflected into the lower part of the spacecraft, just as it was reflected into the lower part here of this polyhedron form. As a matter of fact, I can intensify that reflection even more, like this. Now I'll add color to the spacecraft, starting with the shadow side, like this, adding this green. It leans a little toward the blue-green. And now I'm going to add the halftone, which is that part of the form that is neither in the shadow nor getting the full intensity of the light. Therefore, that's where you find the local color, or the true color of the object or form. So therefore, I'm going to turn to the polyhedron and pick up the color that is right here and add that over here like this. So that's my halftone. And then I'm going to turn to that part of the form that is getting most of the light, which of course is this part of the polyhedron form, and add that over here like this. Now it's very rough, as you can see, because I'm doing this quick. Just want to block in these colors to show you how the color changes and the value as well. So actually it's value, hue, and intensity that change on a form as the form receives more or less light, depending on that, depending on how much or how little light the form receives determines the value, intensity, and hue of the color. And of course, you have to take into consideration the color of the light source, its intensity. That also determines how the local color of the form will change. And now I'm going to add some reflected light, starting with the blue of the background, which is reflected into the shadow. So I'll add some of that reflected blue color up here toward the top of the form, and a little bit here as well, I think toward the middle as well. Now down here, this is where the shadow gets some of this orange color from the ground. That orange color is being reflected into the shadow as well. And I'm going to change the color of that dark part here as well as here. It looks too black, and I want it to be more of a really dark green. I think something like that. Maybe a little darker. I think that's good for now. There's a lot of color variety now within the shadow. The blues and greens and oranges. And now for the cast shadow down here, which is a darker version of the orange color. And since the light is a yellow color, some of that complementary color of the yellow color of the light will appear within the color of the cast shadow. Therefore, I need to pick up some violet color, like this, and add a little bit to that orange color. Mix it in there, cools it. And some of the blue sky color is also reflected within the cast shadow. So I'll add a little bit of that blue of the sky like this. Now I want to talk about highlights. There are two kinds: specular highlights, which occur on smooth, shiny surfaces, and diffuse highlights, which occur on matte surfaces. And with specular highlights, when the light rays hit the surface, they leave that surface at the same angle that they come in at, and they're reflected off that surface, creating rather strong highlights. With a diffuse highlight, the rays of light come in like this, but they're leaving at different angles from that surface, like this. And the light is being diffused, which means it's being spread all over. And that's why you get these light rays going in all different directions, reflecting off of that surface in all different directions, creating this diffuse highlight. Diffuse highlights are not as bright and shiny as specular highlights. Now, you don't have to be too concerned with the physics of light. You have to be concerned with things that an artist needs to know, like what is the color of a highlight? How is a highlight constructed? And let's take, for example, a green surface like this polyhedron or spacecraft, and I'll add a green here. What would the highlight color be? How would the highlight be constructed on a green surface like this? Or for that matter, any surface on which a specular highlight occurs, or a diffuse highlight. So you start out with the color of the surface upon which the highlight occurs. Then there's a shift in color that occurs for the highlight. Since I have a green color here for the surface, the shift of color will occur toward the yellow-green here on the color wheel, the color above the color on the color wheel that is your local color for that form will shift to the color above it. And therefore it's the yellow-green, as I mentioned, because here is the green, and then when the color shifts to the color above green, you come to yellow-green. So therefore, I'm going to add yellow-green to this green, like that. And that yellow-green, as you can see, is more saturated in color than the surface upon which that yellow-green has been placed. And also, it's lighter in value. This is very important. There's a value change, a hue change, and a saturation change that occurs to the highlight. A highlight is a combination of the color of the light source and the local color of the form. So if the light source is yellow, like in my case here, let's say I add yellow. So I'm going to add a blue sky, and then I'll add a yellow light source here. That yellow mixes with the local color of the form, which in this case is green. So when you mix yellow and green, you get yellow-green. So therefore, there's a shift of color from the green to the yellow-green, which I've indicated here. However, this is not the lightest part of the highlight. It is the most saturated part of the highlight. The brightest part of the highlight is a tint of color, but there's a shift in color that occurs again for that brightest part of a highlight. Therefore, that shift in color will be toward the yellow that you see here. Since the brightest part of this highlight is yellow-green, when the shift of color occurs, it occurs to the color above yellow-green, which is yellow. Therefore, that brightest part will be yellow, and I'll pick up the yellow from the color picker, but it's going to be a yellow that has a lot of white in it. It's not going to be white. It's going to be a yellow that has a lot of white in it, but there is still some of that yellow hue within that highlight. And I'll add that to this yellow-green, like this. I'm afraid that's not yellow enough, so I have to go back to the color picker and add some more yellow. I think that's better. And soften the edges. And the brighter part of the highlight fades into the color on which the highlight sits, as you can see, right here and here. It fades into that color, blends into it, in other words. And that lighter part of the highlight is still not right. Like this. And then the more saturated color of the highlight surrounds that more brighter part of the highlight. And usually there's like a hot spot within the highlight, the really bright part of the highlight right there. What I'm trying to show you here is that there is a progression of color from darker, more muted, to lighter and more saturated, and shifting in color, one color up on the color wheel, and then an even lighter value, and again a shift in color to the color above that more saturated part of the highlight. Think in terms of three differences that occur. 1, 2, and then 3. Don't do this, where you have the local color, and then to create the highlight, you do this. You just add white. That's not what is going to make your highlight look convincing. And it's not what actually occurs. So you just can't add white and expect to get the highlight to look right. This highlight would be considered a specular highlight because of how bright it is. A diffuse highlight wouldn't be as bright. Now I'm going to continue working on the spaceship. For a highlight to show up so that it makes a more dramatic appearance on a form, make sure that the surface upon which the highlight occurs is of a darker and a bit more muted color than the more saturated part of the highlight, just like what I indicated here. That part is darker and less saturated in color than this part of the highlight, and this part is lighter in value, and this is darker in value. I decided to change the spacecraft, and I think this one is going to work better than the previous version, but you can still see the things that I did in the previous version, such as adding the reflected light from the ground here and the blue being reflected from the sky toward the top of this spacecraft. Also, you can see the halftone color, which represents the true local color of the object right there. And then, of course, this part, which is receiving most of the light, which is represented on the polyhedron, as you know, right there. And this is the halftone, and this is also a halftone, but it's a lighter halftone. And now it's time to add some highlights. Before I add the highlights, however, I'm going to add what is called the core shadow, and that's the darkest part of the shadow that occurs where the light turns to shadow. So that occurs right around here, and I'll pick up a color from the shadow side, the dark color, and see if that's the one to use. I have to just add a little more blue to it. And now with a soft brush, I'll add that core shadow right there, like this. This is very rough, and I'm going to keep it rough. This is not a finished painting. I'm just trying to show you how all of this is done, and using a rough sketch like this is the quickest way to get these ideas across to you. Now, for the highlight, I'll be using a yellow-green that is more saturated and leaning more toward the yellow, like this. And maybe I'll add it right there and here. Also, where the light turns to shadow is a good place to add highlights, because the shadow will offset the highlight. Because the highlight is light and the shadow is dark, the highlight is going to pop more. Right there, here at the edge where planes turn, one plane turns to another, right here, and also where the shadow is at the edge, right there, right there. Don't overdo it, however, with the highlights. And as you can see, I added the most saturated part of the highlight first. Then I go into the color picker and move more toward the yellow. Remember, there's a shift in color that occurs toward the color above the more saturated color of the highlight on the color wheel, like I showed you. And there's lots of white added to that color. This is a specular highlight. So I'll add that right over the more saturated part of the highlight, as you can see right there. And then it fades out, like this, for example. You see where I added the brightest part of the highlight, and then it gradually fades into the more saturated part of the highlight, right here, like this, see? Then I can widen this highlight Different sized highlights can be added. This adds variety, and variety adds interest. Small highlights like this, specular highlights, add a nice touch and make the form look more convincing. And I'll add some shadows, darken this green and move it in the direction of blue, adding a little more blue to it. Remember the color shift that occurs in shadow, and I'm adding it right there, as you can see. Now that's too saturated. I have to desaturate that shadow color. And also on the other side, over here, there's a shadow. And this establishes small forms within the larger form. This is a small form. This is a small form. All the various forms have highlights. Now remember, the surface on which the highlight sits is darker and more muted. And you can see that on this spacecraft here. This color is more muted than this part of the highlight. Let me enlarge this so you can see it better. See how more muted this color is compared to the more saturated part of the highlight right there? And this part, of course, is the darker part, halftone. I'm going to turn this into a grayscale, and you can see the value of this part right here. See, the highlight is quite a bit lighter. And now I can smooth out some of these highlights using the smudge tool. So I'll smooth that out a little bit. I'm not going to spend too much time on this. And back down to actual size. Now I think I'll enlarge it again and show you some additional work that I'll do. I'm going to add some of these cut lines, as they're called, just lines, and then over here on this part I'm going to add a small form and a cut line right there. And since I added this smaller form, I need to add a highlight to it. Remember, every small form, all the various sized forms on a larger form, they all have their own individual highlights. So you saw that I first added that more saturated part and then the lighter part. And I think I'll add a small form on this side too, maybe right there. And then a highlight. Now, if I wanted to carry this to a finished painting, I still have a lot of work to do on it. And maybe another little form right there. Again, I'll add a highlight. First, the more saturated part of the highlight, and then the lightest part of the highlight, like that. And add a shadow here. Don't forget the core shadow, the darkest part of a shadow. You can see the core shadow right there. See that dark part? And same over here. There's the core shadow. And I think I'll add some more cut lines. Another one right there. And then one down here as well. I'll enlarge this again, and where I added those cut lines, I'm going to add a highlight, and you can see me picking up the more saturated part of the highlight and then adding it here, and then also on the other one, like this. And now I'll pick up the lightest part of the highlight right there, and then add that to the more saturated part of the highlight. And the same thing for this cut line here. I'll pick up the more saturated part of the highlight, which is right there, and then the lightest part. Back down again to actual size. Highlights will appear more dramatic looking when the surface upon which they are placed is darker and grayer, like in my example up here. So if the surface is not dark enough and you want those highlights to really pop, you need to darken the surface and gray it more. So for example, this surface here could maybe be darkened a little bit more. And by darkening that surface, the highlights will pop a little more. And I think that's about as far as I'm going to take this little rough sketch.